Hi, I'm Lucy Ellis, Senior Editor at Scrip, and I'm here at BioEurope Spring in Amsterdam, and I'm joined by Professor John Isaac, who is the Senior Director of Neuroscience for J&J Innovation. So thanks for joining me, John. So neurology is the second most active disease area for VC funding and licensing, according to some recent analysis that we've seen. But there are still huge areas of unmet need within that space. So what's enticing partnership attention, do you think, to this area?
Well, I think you've identified it as the unmet need is clear. So there's a lot of interest in providing patients with medicines, essentially. And so obviously the challenge is these are difficult diseases to treat. And I think that's also reflected then in the desire for VC funding, for partnering from large pharma to help offset the risk by sharing it amongst a number of stakeholders, and potentially also helping smaller companies, biotech, startups, even academic consortia to help develop new concepts, new targets, and ultimately new drugs, which will hopefully help us solve these nasty diseases.
And we both sort of talked about unmet need there, but what are those unmet needs within such a broad space?
Yes, I mean, neurodegeneration is probably the biggest group of disorders in neurology that are attracting most attention. The biggest one is Alzheimer's disease, and that's certainly one of the main focuses for Johnson & Johnson. But of course, there are other very prevalent disorders, Parkinson's disease, for example. And then there are some more rare, really very fast progressing disorders, ALS, for example, and other sort of frontal temporal dementias, which there's a lot of patients who are really, really desperate for new treatments. So I think it's a really important area.
And you mentioned Alzheimer's as one of your focuses there. So what are your key focus areas, and what are you developing there? What have you got going on?
Yeah, so Alzheimer's is a focus for Johnson & Johnson, and as it is for a number of large pharma companies, and that's really been driven by the slightly scary sort of data out there predicting the very large number of people who will be living with Alzheimer's disease, who currently are, and there will be more people living with Alzheimer's disease as we have a continually aging population. The areas of interest are early detection of disease process before one has significant loss of cognitive ability. So that's around biomarkers and diagnostics, and the ability to then bring new medicines in to act as sort of secondary prevention as opposed to trying to reverse disease symptoms once they occur. Working on obviously the two primary pathologies, which is amyloid plaque pathologies and preventing the deposition of amyloid, and preventing tau tangles, so the deposition of tau, which ultimately is thought to be the main driver that ultimately causes the neurodegeneration.
And we haven't seen a lot of progress with the amyloid beta theory, so what are your hopes there and expectations to see? Yeah,
so I would sort of disagree somewhat with the idea there's not been progress. I mean, the progress hasn't been as fast as we have expected, and certainly we don't have a disease-modifying treatment currently. And the reason is these are difficult diseases, and as you know, the clinical experiments are difficult. They take a long time. Phase 2, for example, proof of concept studies, they are very expensive, so there aren't that many companies that will actually be able to invest in doing those phase 2 proof of concepts. But I think there's real hope now that there's clinical molecules that are being tested right now, which in the near future will show efficacy in Alzheimer's disease.
And you were on a panel here at BioEurope called Neurodegeneration, a game of luck or skill, which could be a quite slightly crude title maybe.
Yeah, that's right.
But what are your thoughts on that question then, and what happened within that panel?
Well, I think it's actually a really nice mixture of people. So we had two large pharma reps, myself and from Lilly as well, and then we had a neurologist on the panel, and then we had a sort of high-level clinician who works in academia. So I thought it was a very nice mixture. Very good discussion from a sort of pharma perspective, where the potential opportunities exist, and so there was discussion around the value of amyloid and tau treatments, biomarkers we talked about. But I think actually one of the more important angles that was discussed was the clinical experiments, so clinical trials design. So how does one detect early efficacy in medicine without having to do these very, very long and expensive clinical trials? Yeah. And so there was some interest in the FDA's recent advice or comments about potentially using different endpoints, more sensitive endpoints, as measures of efficacy in the clinic, which I think is really, really positive news, actually.
And what other kind of trends are you noticing within neurology?
So I think in neurology in general, I think there's interest in neuroinflammation as a more general process that's associated with neurodegeneration, and I think there's very good evidence from human disease genetics that neuroinflammation is associated with Alzheimer's disease risk, for example. And I think also similarly with Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease and ALS as well. So I think the general concept that there's a neuroimmune reaction which is contributing to the disease pathogenesis is actually really exciting, and it gives us sort of a new set of targets to go after. And some of these targets have been worked on in peripheral inflammation indications. So there actually may be the potential to join forces with other therapeutic areas that are working on peripheral indications in this respect as well.
And how will that help if there's more of an opportunity for partnering and joining up with different people?
Well, I think it does, because I think you're accessing a broader space in terms of biotechs. One can then start to interact with biotechs who are working on peripheral inflammation as their primary target, but in the back of their minds they want to also work on CNS neurodegeneration disorder specifically. And so certainly I know that a number of companies, and J&J is one of them, are talking to a variety of biotechs that are working in this sort of cross indication space, and I think it's actually going to be a very successful model going forwards.
So as a summary then, what are your hopes and expectations for this research area looking ahead at like 5 to 10 years?
That's a great question. I mean, the hope, of course, from the whole field in Alzheimer's disease is that we will have a disease-modifying treatment that will be hopefully close to launch by 10 years' time, and I'm hoping sooner than that. And of course that really depends on how effective the clinical trials are. And I think the other real hope is early detection. So as I mentioned earlier on, I think biomarkers and diagnostics for detection of neurodegeneration going on before patients, or before you become a patient really, before you have clinical symptoms, is going to be absolutely key to really solving these nasty disorders.
Great. Well, that was really interesting to speak to you more about that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.